Lesson 46, Zion the Pure in Heart, the last lesson of the year for Doctrine and Covenants in Church History, Gospel Doctrine class. I'm going to do something a little bit different today. One of the things that I don't like about the current lesson plan is it doesn't take into account any holidays. And I understand why they decided to do correlation not to, but just kind of bothers me a little bit. So today's going to be a little bit different. I'm going to tell some stories, kind of tie it into the holiday season that we're going through right now. And then hopefully at the end we can bring it all back around and talk about Zion a little bit. So to start off with, a story that probably most people are familiar with, but I'm going to give a little bit of background. In the early 1900s, Europe looked a little bit different than it does today. Not a lot different, but a little bit. And there were a couple defense alliances there. We had the Triple Alliance, or Central Powers, that had Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy there, shown kind of in red. We had the Triple Entente, which was Great Britain, Russia, France, and then most of the other countries were neutral. They weren't part of any alliance, really. Um, and then in 1914, on June 28th, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife were assassinated by a young Serb nationalist. Austria-Hungary immediately made some very harsh demands on Serbia, which it did not want to meet. Russia decided to side with the Serbs, and so we had some problems, right? Austria-Hungary, Serbia's right beneath it. Russia sides with the Serbs, so we have one group from each of the two defense alliances kind of at staring each other down. A month to the day after the assassination, Austria-Hungary decided to declare war on Serbia. Germany told them they would support them in that. A couple days later, Germany declared war on Russia. Then it declared war on France a couple days after that. So we have basically the two defense alliances now at war for the most part. On August 4th, German troops marched through Belgium, so in the northern end there, through Belgium en route to France to fight France. Britain had agreed to help Belgium maintain its neutrality, and so they immediately declared war on Germany. And as you probably figured out, this was how World War I started. That's what we're talking about here. So as Germany began marching through Belgium, that's when Germany and Britain had their first of many confrontations. The Battle of Mons in Belgium was the first between Britain and Germany, definitely not the last, and it was when World War I started for Great Britain. The Germans took more losses here, but ultimately forced a British retreat. During the first 5 months of World War I, you had Great Britain, and Germany trying to both get ahead of each other. So you had Germany pushing through Belgium towards France. You had Great Britain pushing back. Eventually they hit pretty much of a stalemate. You can see the solid red and blue lines here. They just kind of dug in, built trenches, and nobody really made much progress one way or another. The northern end, where the dotted lines are, those were kind of open, and so there was what was called the race to the sea. The Germans tried to get up around the north end to come around and swoop in behind. Great Britain was trying to do the same thing, and they kept clashing and clashing on their way up to the sea, and pretty soon you had trenches and a line all the way down, as this map shows, where nobody was making any progress. By November of 1914, there was just a continuous front line running from the North Sea down all the way to the Swiss frontier, occupied by armies on both sides in defensive positions, and nobody was making any progress at all. So that's November 1914. There was a bunch of peace initiatives that were going on. There was what was called the Open Christmas Letter. It was a letter penned by Emily Hobhouse, who was a British welfare campaigner. She got 101 different British women to sign it, and it was a public message for peace, and it was addressed to the women of Germany and Austria, and it was published, kind of to encourage peace. Another thing, the newly appointed Pope Benedict on December 7th, 1914, begged for an official truce between the warring governments, asking at least that, quote, that the guns may fall silent at least upon the night the angels sang, end quote, which was officially rebuffed. There was no interest in anything of the sorts. So the two sides stayed locked in a stalemate, with trenches, just firing back and forth against each other, lobbing mortars back and forth against each other, and there was no real progress made on any side. There were, however, as the Christmas season approached, there were some impromptu ceasefires. The earliest one that was recorded happened on December 18th, and the British High Command was very alarmed that there was ceasefires, and then concerned that Christmas season might actually inspire goodwill, and so they issued a stern order against fraternization. Officers were warned that the Yuletide benevolence might destroy the offensive spirit in all ranks, right? So we can't have any Christmas spirit in the war zone because we're at war. That was their biggest concern. But the Germans, they were stubbornly festive, actually. This is an actual picture from their trenches as they're decorating a Christmas tree. And they actually used the Christmas season to try to bolster morale. They sent Christmas trees to their forces, and all along the line, that stalemate line that we showed on the map, the English could hear Germans singing. They would stop shooting. Normally there was no lights at night because snipers would shoot at the lights, where they were lighting candles and putting up lanterns and singing songs. And on Christmas Eve, the Germans were singing Silent Night, and it echoed across no man's land. And eventually the British joined in, and the two sides together on Christmas Eve were singing Silent Night. And then somebody on the German side yelled across in English, "Tomorrow is Christmas. If you don't fight, we won't." And normally, when the sun came up, that's when the mortars started and the rifle fire, artillery fire. But on Christmas Day, there was this eerie quiet all along the front. And as the sun rose, the Germans called for the British to meet them in no man's land, which they weren't sure they wanted to do. They expected, some sort of sabotage or slaughter or something. There was a captain on the English side. Captain Stockwell was his name, and he said it was one of the most curious Christmas days we are likely to ever see. He was pretty intent on obeying his orders. He tried desperately to ignore the German goodwill. He tried to get all his troops to ignore their goodwill. But then one of his sergeants reported that the Germans were standing unarmed and in full view, and asked for permission to shoot them. And he looked across and saw that the Germans were just standing there unarmed, and they were yelling across, "Don't shoot. We don't want to fight today. We will send you some beer." And the English were getting a little excited about that, and Captain Stockwell was a little concerned and that his men were getting a little excited, so he yelled across that he wanted to meet with his German counterpart. So an officer from the German side emerged and walked across no man's land. Stockwell met him halfway, and the first thing Stockwell said was, you know, we're under orders. My men have orders not to fraternize, and they could open fire at any moment. And the German responded, well, my orders are the same as yours, but could we not have a truce from shooting today? We don't want to shoot, do you? And they had a bit of a long discussion and finally agreed not to fight. And so as Stockwell turned back toward his trench, the German called out, you had better take the beer, we have lots. And then in response, Stockwell gave the German a plum pudding. And for the rest of the day, all Christmas Day, 1914, not a shot was fired. All along the line, it wasn't uniform all along the line. There were some areas where there was some shots fired, but generally speaking, all along the line, Christmas Day was shaped by the willingness of the soldiers to disobey orders. And many soldiers later recalled back thinking of that day, talking about meeting with their enemies, shaking hands, singing songs, exchanging presents. Joint services were held. Somebody threw out a soccer ball, a football they called it, which then started getting kicked around. And it wasn't, a normal soccer game. There was about 70 Germans playing against 50 Englishmen. And everybody was just having a good time. It's estimated that 100,000 British and German troops were involved in the unofficial cessation of hostility along the Western Front. And in many sectors, the truce not only lasted all the way through Christmas night, but sometimes continued all the way until New Year's Day. Obviously, the soldiers were not anxious to be shooting at each other. And here is a statue memorializing, you got the German soldier and the English soldier playing soccer with each other. So that, word spread about that. And that was, a blatant act of rebellion against authority. They had said none of that was to happen. And even though, peace was about as far from these guys' minds as possible, they were shooting at each other every day, and they were dug in their trenches. Somehow they were able to find peace on earth in the middle of a war zone. Now, generals on both sides were very upset about that, and they were determined to prevent fraternization in the future, so they saw to it that such activities would be severely punished. And for the rest of World War I, there were no more Christmas truces, and they didn't happen in World War II. But there were times in World War II where we saw a little bit of the Christmas spirit. Here we have on the left, we have Charlie Brown. He was a B-17 pilot with the 379th Bombardment Group of the United States Army Air Forces. And he was stationed at RAF Kimballton in England. On the right, we have Franz Stigler, who was a veteran German fighter pilot. He had 27 victories to his name. And once you hit 30 victories, when you were a German fighter pilot, you got the coveted Knight's Cross. And so shooting down 3 more fighter planes or 1 bomber plane, because a bomber was equal to 3 points, he would have got the iron or the Knight's Cross. So a couple days before Christmas in 1943, Lieutenant Brown was to pilot Ye Olde Pub, a B-17 bomber. It was the first mission for the Ye Olde Pub's crew, and they were to target an aircraft production facility in Bremen, Germany. In a pre-mission briefing, they were told they might encounter hundreds of German fighters on the way, and that Bremen was guarded by 250 flak guns. And Brown's crew was assigned to fly Purple Heart Corner, a spot down on the edge of the formation. It was considered especially dangerous because the Germans loved to target the edges instead of shooting straight through the middle of the formation. So that's how they left England, was down there in Purple Heart Corner. But before they got crossed over, another bomber had mechanical issues, had to turn back, so they actually moved up to the front of the formation. Here is a picture of the ye olde pub crew before they take off. So Charlie Brown's B-17 began its bomb run at 27,000 feet with an outside air temperature of negative 76 degrees Fahrenheit. But before the bomber released its load, flak coming from Bremen, accurate flak shots shattered the plexiglass nose, knocked out the number 2 engine, damaged the number 4 engine, and slowed the bomber way down. They took a lot of fire, got damaged, and ended up falling back out of formation and became a straggler, which is not what you want to be, left alone out there. And so as they were struggling to keep up and get where they needed to go, they got attacked by over a dozen enemy fighters. And so obviously a lot more damage was sustained. The number 3 engine was damaged and could only produce half power. So you combine that with the number 2 engine being gone and the number 4 engine being damaged, the aircraft had at best 40% of its total rated power available. So it was really struggling to stay in the air and make any time, make any movement at all. The internal oxygen, hydraulic, and electric systems were damaged. Half of its rudder was damaged, its port elevator, as well as its nose cone. A lot of the gunner's weapons were jammed, probably due to the cold temperature. They were getting frozen. The whole thing is full of holes. So lots of issues there. And most of the crew were wounded, including Brown. He was wounded in his right shoulder, and all the morphine on board was frozen, so they couldn't administer morphine to anybody. The radio was destroyed, and the exterior was very heavily damaged. Miraculously, only one of the crew members died, but the rest were pretty badly wounded for the most part. So they turned around. They were trying to get out of there, and as they were flying, they were by themselves. Obviously, they had lost the formation. Some Germans on the ground spotted them. One of them was Franz Stigler, that veteran fighter pilot we were talking about. He was refueling and rearming. He saw them in the air, and he jumped in his plane and took off and quickly caught up to them. And through the damaged bomber's airframe, he was able to see the crew. He could look through the holes in the plane and see the crew. So that's an artist's rendition. You can see some holes there. So there he is. He's looking through, looking at them. And he remembered he had been in North Africa fighting with the Germans, and he remembered one of his commanding officers said, "If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." And he said, later recalling this incident, he said, "To me, it was just like they were in a parachute. I saw them and I couldn't shoot them down." Now remember, he could have shot down that bomber. It would have counted for 3 and he would have got his Knight's Cross, but he didn't. He tried to motion to them to get them to land at a German airfield and surrender. They wouldn't do that. They didn't know what he was trying to get them to do. So he tried to get them to land in Sweden. They wouldn't do that. And Brown was just flying. He had he had no idea what Stigler wanted, and all he wanted to do was get out of there. So what Franz Stigler actually ended up doing was flying close enough to Brown's plane in a formation on the bomber's port side wing so that the German anti-aircraft units couldn't shoot it down because he was in the way. He escorted them over the coast until they reached open water, and then once the bomber was out of German airspace, he gave them a salute and departed. And the ye olde pub crew was able to make it back to England. It was another 250 miles, and they landed at the Air Force Base Seething. And during a post-flight debriefing, he told his commanding officers what happened, and they said, "Oh, don't tell anybody that. We don't want anybody, thinking the Germans have any positive sentiment towards the Germans." And Brown later commented, "Someone decided you can't be a human you can't be human and be flying in a German cockpit. Interesting story. The two found each other again in 1990, and they became close friends until their deaths within months of each other in 2008. That's a picture of them at a meeting shortly before they passed away, with Charlie Brown on the left there and Franz Stiegler on the right. So Christmas, maybe it was Christmas, maybe it wasn't, but Franz let them live when he could have shot them down and would have been doing what his commanding officers expected him to do, and also would have won a very coveted award from the military. So a year later in World War II was Battle of the Bulge. It was the last major German offensive campaign. You can see here the purple line is where the front was. The red lines are the Germans advancing through. You can see that bulge that they make. When you look at the dotted purple line, it makes this bulge. The Germans really made it was a surprise attack. The Allied forces were completely unprepared, and the Germans made a lot of progress and advanced across the line there. And the American forces incurred the highest fatalities in the Battle of the Bulge. It really did a number on them. And what I want to talk about today is there's 3 American soldiers, one who had been badly wounded, who were part of Battle of the Bulge, who got lost in the woods, and they had been walking for 3 days looking for the American troops. They could hear bombs going off, gunfire all around them, but they were lost. They didn't know where they were, and they were looking for the American troops. Now, the forest where Battle of the Bulge was fought was pretty thick and snowy, and so they're trying to make it through, sleeping outside in the cold, doing whatever, hoping they don't get caught by the Germans. And they come across a cabin in the forest on their 3rd day. They've been walking for 3 days, and they come across this cabin on Christmas Eve. And there's smoke coming out the chimney, so they know somebody's there. So inside the cabin was 12-year-old Fritz Wicken. It's a picture of him there, and his mother Elizabeth. The Wickens had been bombed out of their home in a nearby city and had managed to move into this hunting cabin in the forest. Fritz's father stayed in town to work and would come out to visit them whenever he could, but for the most part, he wasn't there. They were hoping he was going to make it for Christmas, but he hadn't come. It was late Christmas Eve, and so they had decided they would hold off on slaughtering their rooster and boiling their potatoes, and they would have their Christmas dinner whenever Fritz's father, Elizabeth's husband, could make it. But then they hear a knock on the door. So Elizabeth blew out the candles and opened the door crack and looked out to find 2 enemy American soldiers standing at the door with a 3rd one lying in the snow. They were pretty heavily armed, and she knew they could have simply burst in, but they hadn't. They had knocked first. So she let them in. She invited them in, and they carried their wounded comrade into the warm cabin. She didn't speak English, and they didn't speak German, but they managed to communicate in broken French. She kind of spoke French, and they kind of spoke French, so they were able to at least talk. They told her their story, that they'd been wandering and lost for 3 days. They didn't know where they were. And so Elizabeth decided that they were going to cook the Christmas meal anyway. So she told Fritz to go get 6 potatoes and get the rooster. And they would cook the Americans a meal. Now, there were a lot of soldiers all throughout that forest, both German and American. And while Herman roasted, there was another knock at the door. Fritz went to open it, and both him and Elizabeth expected it would be more lost Americans. But when he opened it, there were 4 German soldiers. And Elizabeth knew that because she had Americans inside, they could shoot her on sight. So she pushed past Fritz and stepped outside, and began to talk to him, and they wished her a Merry Christmas, but they said they were lost and they were hungry, and they were hoping that she could help them out. And Elizabeth told them that they were welcome to come in to the warmth and eat until the food was all gone, but she warned them that there were others inside who they would not consider friends. The corporal in the group stiffened up and sharply asked her if there were Americans inside, and she said, yes, there are 3 Americans inside. They were lost and they were cold, just like you, and one of them is wounded. And they kind of had this staring match. They stared at each other for a while. And then Elizabeth said, it is the holy night, and there will be no shooting here. If you want to come in, you got to leave your weapons outside. Which they did. They'd left their weapons outside, came in. She went inside. She took all the Americans' weapons and put them outside. So you had 3 Americans and 4 Germans on Christmas Eve night in this cabin. And there was a lot of fear and tension at first. But, the smell of a roasting rooster, and the warmth of the cabin kind of wore down their apprehension. And the Germans took out a bottle of wine and a loaf of bread. And while Elizabeth was finishing up the cooking, one of the German soldiers, who happened to be an ex-medical student, examined the wounded American. And in English, he explained that the cold had prevented infection, but he had lost a lot of blood and he needed food and rest. By the time the meal was ready, the atmosphere was more relaxed. Everyone was getting along. It turned out 2 of the Germans were only 16. The corporal was 23 years old. Elizabeth said grace, everybody ate, and everybody slept inside the worn cabin. The next morning, the Germans looked at the Americans' map, told them the best way to get back to their lines, gave them a compass, and they said, well, shouldn't we go over here to this city? And the corporal shook his head and said, no, don't go there. It's in German hands. He says, if you want to get back to the Americans, this is the way you got to go. So they went outside. Elizabeth gave them all their weapons back. They shook hands with each other, and the Germans went one way, and the Americans went the other way. This is a picture of 1995. Fritz, who was 12 years old at the time, was able to find a couple of those soldiers. And this gentleman here was Ralph Blank. He actually still had the map and the compass from that night. But there it was on Christmas Eve, even though, after the big truce in World War I, everybody said no more truces. Here we had a little small Christmas truce in World War II with 4 Germans soldiers, 3 American soldiers, and a German mother and her son. So skipping ahead just a little bit to the Korean War, June 25th, 1950. This is a ship called the Meredith Victory. It was sailing out of Norfolk, Virginia, and it was carrying ammunition tanks and trucks from Japan to supply American troops in North Korea. By Christmas in 1950, China had joined the North Korean communists and kind of turned the tide on the war, and the American and South Korean troops and North Korean civilians really got hammered at Chosin Reservoir, and the United Nations were retreating after that, and over 100,000 United Nations Command troops were gathering in the city of Hungnam for evacuation, and about the same number of civilians had also gathered in the port, hoping to also get out of Dodge. There were 193 ships that were there, and this ship, the SS Meredith Victory, this is the captain there, Captain Leonard LaRue. When he was coming up onto the up near the port, he says, I trained my binoculars on the shore and saw a pitiable scene. Korean refugees thronged the docks. With them was everything they could wheel, carry, or drag. Beside them, like frightened chicks, were their children. Now remember, this is not a passenger ship. This ship was designed to carry supplies, ammunition, tanks, trucks. So it had a crew of 47, and then it could carry 12 passengers, I believe. So we're looking at roughly 60 people is what that ship was designed to hold. And when Captain LaRue saw those refugees on the docks, he made the decision to unload nearly all the weapons and supplies from his ship so that he could evacuate refugees as well. It was December 22nd, 1950, and from afternoon until the next morning, LaRue and his crew loaded women, babies, and old men into the ship's 5 cargo holds. The refugees were standing shoulder to shoulder on deck. Their baggage was left behind in order to fit as many people as possible on board. The 5 cargo holds and the entire main deck were were full to capacity. So even though the ship was built to accommodate 12 passengers besides the 47 crew and staff, Captain LaRue loaded more than 14,000 Korean civilians who were fleeing the approaching communists on board his ship. The Meredith Victory sailed shortly after 11 a.m. on December 23rd with the plan of going south to Busan, about 450 sea miles away. That was their planned route, to go down there. They had no means of self-defense. They were sailing through mine-infested waters. They had no mine detection equipment. They had no doctor, no interpreter. They had no lighting in the cargo holds. They had no heat. They had no sanitation facilities. Obviously, the ship was made for 60 people. It had 14,000. The only gun on the entire ship was the pistol in the captain's pocket. Years later, as LaRue was looking back on the trip, he said, "I think often of that voyage. I think of how such a small vessel was able to hold so many persons and surmount endless perils without harm to a soul. And as I think, the clear, unmistakable message comes to me that on that Christmas tide, in the bleak and bitter waters off the shores of Korea, God's own hand was at the helm of my ship." There was hardly any food or water on board, and the people were pretty much unable to move. They were packed in there so tight. And they had to stand up. There was standing room only, but there were no injuries, no casualties. The people made it safe and sound to Busan in South Korea on December 24th, Christmas Eve. But they were turned away. The city was already overwhelmed by refugees and wasn't willing to take these 14,000. So they went back out to sea. Captain LaRue remarked about this. He said, "I was reminded of the first Christmas Eve when there was no room." And so they ended up going another 50 miles down to, I don't know how to say it, Kojedu, and spent Christmas headed to there. And on the 26th of December, there were 2 Navy ships there that normally land tanks during beach combat who took the refugees and brought them to shore. Not one person died through the whole ordeal, and in fact, the human cargo actually increased. 5 babies were born during the trip, and they were delivered by the first mate, who only had basic first aid training. Now, a little side note, among the evacuated refugees were the parents of Moon Jae-in, the 19th president of South Korea. He was born right there in Goji Island 2 years after the evacuation. The U.S. Maritime Administration has called this the greatest rescue operation by a single ship in history. And that's a picture of a thank you card written by some of those refugees. Now, some of these stories have been, a little fantastic. They're all true. The Christmas truce there in the World War I. Franz Stigler not shooting down the B-17 bomber in Christmas of 1943 in World War II. The German and American soldiers having their own little Christmas truce, Christmas of 1944, and Captain LaRue offloading all of his supplies to take on 14,000 refugees in a ship designed to hold only 60 in Christmas of 1950. Now, as I was looking at researching for Christmas stories to share here, I found a lot of them. I picked those. Those all happened to, be during wartime, and I picked those kind of on purpose. Those men were blatantly disregarding orders, which is a pretty severe thing to do in wartime, and basically putting their own lives on the line um, for the Christmas spirit, you could even say. There are innumerable Christmas stories, Christmas miracles like that. There's stories where something happened that impacted millions of people, and there's stories where something happened that impacted just one. But the point is that this is the season where Jesus is the topic of conversation. He's at the center for billions of people around the world. It's Christmas, right? It's Christmas. And even in war, where there is no peace, where you question humanity, where everything is ugly, these people were able to find beauty, and they were able to find the Christmas spirit. Christmas is kind of unlike any other holiday. It generally brings out the best in everyone. Christmas is love. Christmas is faith. Christmas is Jesus. Christmas is hope. Christmas is peace, right? Christmas is gift giving. It's laughter. Christmas is family. Christmas is kindness and generosity and joy. And that permeates and penetrates even when people are in situations where that's not typically seen. The love, faith, hope, peace, laughter, family, gift giving is not typical of a war zone, and yet here we have it. And why? Well, because of Jesus, right? When we get right down to it, it's all about Jesus. But Christmas really should not just be in December. The love, the faith, the hope, the peace, the laughter, the family, the kindness, the generosity, the joy, it should be all the time. John 13:34, Jesus said, "A new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another as I have loved you, that ye also love one another." And I wanted to talk about these stories because the Christmas spirit brought out in these people who the only reason they were where they were was to kill each other, basically. And yet, because of Christmas, because of the Christmas spirit, because of Jesus, they found kinship, they found friendship. And if you look at Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler, they became best friends for 20 years once they found each other again. Fritz goes and finds the American soldiers, and they still have the compass and the map. Christmas brought these people together. The spirit of Christmas, the spirit of Christ, brought these people together. The very essence of Christmas is sharing. It's giving to those in need. We have a tendency in December to focus on it and to do more to bless those who are less fortunate than we do at other times, right? Well, what is Zion? Zion, as the lesson says, is the pure in heart. From the lesson manual, it says Zion can mean the Lord's people, the pure in heart, a specific place or both. In this lesson, when we speak about building Zion in our day, we are referring to purifying our hearts so that the places we live can be called Zion, even if that place where you live is a war zone. You can purify your heart, you can put Jesus first, and you can live in Zion. As I researched this lesson, it talked about the theoretical and the theological aspects of Zion, parsing it, the word out and what it means and how, and what we need to do to become a Zion people and to live in Zion. But I wanted to talk about, especially since it was Christmas, people who find Zion, people who maybe just for a brief moment, maybe for longer, live a Zion life in our day. And I think these stories represent that. People who are in a time, they're in a place where there is no love, there is no hope, there is no happiness, and yet they're able to find it. They're able to bring it out, and they're able to find Zion and live as a Zion people, even if just for a brief time. The Dalai Lama said, "Our prime purpose in this life is to help others." And I think if we can be more like these stories, if we can focus more on the hope, the love, the forgiveness, the sharing, not just at Christmas time, right? Because these stories show people who were at war, and maybe they would have done this not with the Christmas spirit, but I think Christmas really helped them to live as a Zion people in the middle of a war zone. And so if we can do that the rest of the year, then we'll have accomplished what we're here to do, and we'll be a Zion people. Thank you.